Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're very delighted to have with us this evening journalist turned policy analyst and author, Sarah Chayes, here to talk about her book, On Corruption in America and What is at Stake. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point during the discussion, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of On Corruption in America. Also, a word of thanks to our friends at the New Republic for partnering with us on this event. Sarah's had a number of quite interesting and varied jobs over the past few decades. She was a journalist reporting for NPR from Paris for 6 years, starting in 1996, which is how she ended up covering the US invasion of Afghanistan and the fall of the Taliban in 2001. Not long after that, she decided to leave radio reporting and stay in Afghanistan, helping run an aid organization and later establishing a soap-making cooperative in the southern city of Kandahar. She went on to advise senior US military commanders in Afghanistan and then became a special advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen. She left the Pentagon for a 5-year stint as a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she focused on the global security implications of public corruption. Along the way, she wrote 2 previous books, The Punishment of Virtue, a critique of American policy in post-Taliban Afghanistan, and Thieves of State, about acute government corruption around the world and the role it plays, not only in social breakdown, but also in violent extremism. In On Corruption in America, which was first published last year and has just come out in paperback, Sarah turns her analytical skills on this country, provides a sweeping account of how corrupt networks of government and private sector elites have resulted in tremendous inequality and policies that fail to serve most Americans. A mix of history, analysis, and polemic, Sarah's provocative book will definitely rile you up. Or as Robert Kaiser wrote in the Washington Post, Sarah's, quote, strong opinions will offend some readers and persuade others. None will be bored. In conversation with Sarah this evening will be Timothy Noah, a staff writer at the New Republic, where he began his journalism career 4 decades ago, although Tim is now on his 3rd tour of duty there, having worked for a number of other prominent publications since. He's reported for the Wall Street Journal, edited U.S. News and World Report, covered Congress for Newsweek, worked on the New York Times op-ed page, edited the Washington Monthly, written for Slate, and served as labor policy editor for Politico. Plus, Tim came out 9 years ago with a terrific book on income inequality titled The Great Divergence. And he's edited 2 anthologies of the writings of his late first wife, Marjorie Williams. So, Sarah and Tim, the screen is yours.
Thank you for that terrific introduction for both of us. And Sarah, I'm delighted to be here to talk about corruption in American government, which is one of those hardy perennials. But we'll be talking a little bit about the periods in American history when it seems to be most prominent. But I wanted to start with just inviting you to talk about the event that, as you describe it in the book, was the precipitating event for you writing this book, which was the Supreme Court throwing out the bribery conviction of Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell. This seemed like an open and shut case to most of us. The bribes were the fact that things of great value were given to McDonnell and his family was simply undeniable, and the fact that he was trying to help the person giving these gifts with the regulatory process and approval for these dubious patent oil, I think is what I called it when I wrote about it at the time. I forget precisely, diet supplements. Favors were done on this man's behalf, somewhat ineffectually, it's true, but that's because government policy is not an on-off switch. And anyway, why don't you tell us a little bit about how that decision, that Supreme Court decision, struck you and how it led you to write this book?
Thanks for starting with that, because here we are, a local crowd, right? We're all in town, and Governor McDonald was just across the river. And so it's a case where our kind of local politics really, I think, impacted or were a kind of symptom of something really major happening across the country. And, I saw the case the way you did, right? He was a guy who had gotten, and it was things of value, but compared to some bribery and corruption, it was relatively cheap in all senses of the word, I guess, but it was very clear exchange. I mean, what was always difficult to prove in a bribery case is that there is a direct exchange. And so the prosecution had to do it by timing, and there would be a call from the benefactor, and 5 minutes later, a call from McDonald, trying to get a member of his administration to do something. He had been convicted by a unanimous jury of his peers. The conviction was upheld unanimously by an appeals court. And then it was overturned in July of 2016. And what really blew me away was that the Supreme Court decision was unanimous. Mm-hmm. Not only that, but to stick with local politics or to stick with local culture, who was I hearing about this decision from but Diane Rehm? I hope everybody listening to us this evening remembers fondly Diane Rehm's show when it was still on every night. And she was, and she had picked her panel to span the political spectrum. And her whole panel came down saying that they would have voted the same way if they had been on the Supreme Court. And that's where I got really worried, because it meant that there was a complete disconnect between the way most American people understood corruption. This was in your face, as you say, open and shut corruption. And I think the vast majority of people in the country would have been paying attention or asked about it, would have thought the same thing. And yet, the kind of professional governing elite of our country unanimously saw it the other way. And that was something that I had experienced in developing countries when there's just corruption in your face and the population is getting more and more indignant about it. But the elites are basically saying, don't worry about that. It's part of our culture. Well, in a way, wasn't the Supreme Court saying this is just part of our culture? This is how we do politics? People would say if you upheld his conviction, you would be criminalizing politics. In other words, this is part of our culture. And everywhere else that I had seen that kind of a disconnect around the world, I had seen these explosive reactions. Be it joining the Taliban or Boko Haram in Afghanistan and Nigeria, or the Arab Spring, where you had a wave of revolutionary uprisings across an entire region. And so I kind of saw an explosion coming toward us. And this is July 2016. So essentially, the Supreme Court is saying they're dismissing corruption. They're saying this is not a threat to our system. And 2 weeks later, Mr. Trump starts chanting, "Drain the swamp."
Right. Well, that's, I want to pause a little bit on McDonald. The texture of the McDonald scandals is so rich. He was a Bible thumper, sanctimonious Bible thumper. a proponent of family values, whose defense was that my crazy, awful wife was driving all of this, and he blamed it entirely on his wife, and said that their marriage was such a sham that they couldn't have plotted together to participate in any kind of bribery scheme. And it was just a really sort of stomach turning moment, even for seasoned reporters like you and me. I remember writing at the time, comparing Bob McDonnell's family values to those of Cray Deeds. I don't know if you remember Cray Deeds, who ran against McDonnell and lost to him. He was a Democrat. And a couple of years after he lost, Cray Deeds' son, who was schizophrenic, and I'm going to choke up, I love this story. His son was schizophrenic, and was denied a hospital bed for some stupid budget cutting reason, and was brought home, where he proceeded to come very close to killing Cray Deeds, and killed himself. And I believe that's right. And Deeds, when he was asked about it, he said, "My son is my hero." And I just find that such a moving story, and such a stark contrast on the topic of family values with Bob McDonnell. Just sort of such an affirmation of real, true family values and love in the face of the worst kind of abuse from somebody who almost killed you, but was his son. I'm sorry, I get a little mushy about this, but I just find it such a moving story. So in any case, you proceeded from the presumption that in the United States, as in other countries, the awareness of corruption was undermining faith in government. But there's also an irony here, which is that you can practically set your watch by the fact that the politicians who make the biggest stink about quote unquote corruption with the broadest brush tend to be the most corrupt politicians of all. And Trump, I think, is an excellent example of that. Would you agree?
What I would say is that as corruption has been sort of crystallizing into an operating system that really takes hold in countries around the world. I mean, I've been on half a dozen continents and looked at countries and governments that are starkly dissimilar. And yet I find the same patterns repeating themselves over and over again. And as this happens, the level of public indignation rises. And as I say, it often spins off into these extreme directions. And ironically, since I've been watching this closely, which is about 2008, I have not seen a single case where a genuine reformer has captured that public indignation. It's usually captured either by some extremist movement, or by usually the corrupt network itself fielding a kind of phony, like Jimmy Morales in Guatemala, who was the number of comedians, also Ukraine, the current president of Ukraine was a television star. I mean, somehow, so you get this sort of outsider who, as you point out, often will run on an anti-corruption platform, but is either a front for or a card-carrying member of, the corrupt network itself. So it's basically either a spoiler or a front for the corrupt network who captures the public indignation. And that I cannot figure out why. I
can't
cannot
figure it
figure out.
either. And with Trump in particular, it just seemed to me it was so transparently true that he was involved in corrupt things. He was being sued while he was running for president for running this fake university. And I could not understand how he managed to be successful in deflecting attention to that, attention to numerous examples of financial abuses, examples of sexual improprieties, even rape, alleged rape, I should say, simply by saying that Washington was a swamp. Why does that work?
I think when people are driven far enough, what they want is a wrecking ball. You know, it's like I'm sitting in Kandahar and people are drifting back toward the Taliban because of the corruption of the government in Afghanistan. Now, it's like they're not, how to put it, when people are that indignant, they're not doing subtle political analysis anymore. They're looking to blow something up. And Trump was definitely going to blow it up. Mm-hmm. And so that's the point. It's not that you're beyond where it's a nice comparison between this brand of toothpaste and that brand of toothpaste, right? The problem is that too often when you vote for a wrecking ball, it's your head that gets smashed in, you know? Mm-hmm. Let me back up just a second though, and make a little distinction on what it is I'm getting at when I'm talking about corruption, because I mean, as poignant as your story was, and as tawdry, to use the Supreme Court's word, as the McDonnell case was, I think we get distracted by the one-off cases like that, you know, and so it becomes a scandal, and then there's another scandal, and you kind of roll your eyes, but what I find to be what the really dangerous thing that's going on is that it becomes an operating system of networks that are sophisticated, that wind across all the categories that we use to divide up the way our society runs. So, you know, there are members of government, there are members of, you know, big industry, big philanthropists or nonprofits, and often out and out criminals who are actually working together in a sort of loose, dynamic organization, but it is an organization that has a collective interest and a collective action. And the role of the members of that network who are in government is not so much to pocket the money or pocket public money or take bribes, which they do. Mm-hmm. But the important thing they do is restructure, they kind of torque and twist and turn the structures of government itself until they serve the network rather than serving the public. And it means that our anti-corruption legislation it's aimed in the wrong direction. It's aimed at these transactions, and it narrows and narrows and narrows the definition of a corrupt transaction, when very often these transactions are deferred, or they're indirect, or they're not, you know, money, they're favors, but the favors happen later, or they happen to a third party. Do you see what I mean? Again, if you're talking about a network, it means that the favors can go around the circle, and it may be the fourth person who repays the originator.
Well, let's talk about the pattern since the 80s.
Yeah,
we're talking about that now. It seems to me, looking at it, that we begin with an ideology. We begin with a very conservative, anti-government ideology, and that. The over time, the ideology recedes and the play of interests comes to the fore. So that by the time we have Donald Trump as president, he's no longer motivated by ideology. He's no longer really preaching an anti-government viewpoint. He is simply serving business interests, and he's pretty blatant about it. And I think we've seen a similar evolution among Republicans in Congress. Washington, back in the 80s, even into the 90s, conservatives were kind of pointy-headed, and they had ideological justifications for what they wanted to do. And these justifications allowed for the rise of income inequality, which I wrote about in my book, and allowed for a decline of labor, a rise of the power of capital. But there was an ideology behind it. And there was some point at which the ideology became irrelevant, and the serving of business lobby interests became more naked. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite buy it, actually. And let me move backwards again and say that so this book is on corruption in America it's a bit of an odd book, because I start in the present, basically, but then actually look at some of the underlying issues. The first one being the role of money in human society, actually. And then also how we're primates, and primates are normally very hierarchical. And we actually, for about 150,000 years, were egalitarian. And we did that by policing the meat hogs, because we needed to share the meat that we were pulling down. So that's a kind of background, which I actually think comes to play in 1980. I actually think the first thing that happened around 1980 was a shift from a relative egalitarian period that lasted from approximately 1935 to approximately 1980. And so it's a cultural shift first. The first thing, more important, the first important thing, I think, I don't want to put it all on Reagan, but he does become a sort of symbol. He starts flaunting wealth, and wealth becomes, but it's in our popular culture too. And wealth becomes something that is to be admired for its own sake. And what struck me so much looking at 1980 was how it led to a repeat. So I said there was this brief period of egalitarianism. Before that, we had 70 years of systemic corruption in this country from about 1870 to about 1935. And the results were, crash after crash after crash after crash, once about every 8 to 10 years.
I want to dispute that your description of the Gilded Age, because I think you're doing a disservice to the people who, among other things, founded the New Republic magazine.
All right. Well, can we hold on that? Can we hold on that?
Was an interruption of what you're talking about, but certainly period from the 1870s. Well, the Gilded Age technically was really from the 1870s until about 1900, coinciding with the Belle Epoque in France that you talk about. But really, the big change came with the advent of a permanent income tax in the United States, which was something that the progressives achieved. And there were other changes that happened during the progressive movement.
Can I hold us on this? Can I hold this and just go back to your other question before we confuse people entirely? So starting in 1980, I actually think, so I think first of all, you have a change in culture, which is that wealth becomes admirable for its own sake. But secondly, you look, there really was a plan to dismantle the relatively egalitarian kind of situation that had held from the New Deal. And that plan was laid out in the early 1970s. And there was nothing ideological about it. And I would even say, what's the ideology of small government? It's to leave businesses unfettered, right? So the first thing that starts to happen is dismantling antitrust enforcement, right? And then you have deregulation. Right. So I don't quite understand the distinction between naked wealth accumulation and ideology. It's an ideology that favors naked wealth accumulation, you know, and so there's that period. And then I think what's almost equally damaging is that Bill Clinton basically rubber stamped it. If that earlier period of radical deregulation, radical anti-government action had been branded as a radical sort of aberration, it's possible that we could have, you know, recovered a more, I want to say, humane and contained type of capitalism. But instead, you had the Democratic Party rubber stamping it and even going further. And then it becomes bipartisan orthodoxy. And I think that's where you also then get a tendency on the part of the population to, you know, bail out of politics, because it does start to seem like both sides, at least in terms of the political economy, are sharing, again, it's like the unanimous Supreme Court decision. They're pretty much on the same page.
Let's go back to 1870. Maybe we can sort of find some agreement there. 1870, the Gilded Age is, I think, the most corrupt period in American history.
I think we're pretty close.
We are moving in that direction for sure. I still think the Gilded Age was more corrupt. And so we just sort of look at the sweep of American history. Why? Why 1870? Well, boom times. Boom times create a very, very hospitable environment for greed and corruption, two things you talk about a lot in your book.
I don't think I talk about greed. Did you find the word greed in the book?
The Midas disease, isn't that?
Yeah.
Greed.
I'm not sure it's greed. It's you know what it is, Brad. Sorry, Brad, I'm saying when you're Tim. I'm so sorry, Tim. You know what it is? It's when your social standing is measured by money. Mm-hmm. And I think that's not always been true in this country. I think there are periods when it's true. I'm going back to culture here. Mm-hmm. When your social standing is measured by the number of zeros in your bank account, that's a race with no finish line. It's not about being greedy because you want more, because you want to do more with it. It's about competition. It's about beating out, whoever you're competing with.
But there was a disruption. I mean, this flood of money disrupted all of society. It disrupted
that's right.
Society. I mean, it was the Industrial Revolution. People moved from the farms to the cities. It turned everything.
Well, they were forced off the farms into the cities. Often.
I would disagree that there are an awful lot of people who, in the first 20 years of the 20th century, were desperate to move to the cities. But yes, there were also circumstances that pushed many of them out of the Dust Bowl and other areas. But you have this tremendous boom that creates a class of fantastically wealthy people who set about bribing the government. People sort of tend not to remember that the Gilded Age, the Mark Twain's first novel with Charles Dudley Warner, isn't so much about the world of business. A lot of it is about the world of Washington, D.C., and about how that money finds its way into the political process in fantastically corrupt ways. So we have this rich period of corruption. As you write in your book, this inspires some pushback eventually from the populists, who don't particularly succeed, but their ideas are, many of their ideas are adopted by the progressive movement in the early part of the 20th century, prior to World War I. And there you do see a really meaningful creation of countervailing forces against, you can't make people stop being greedy. You can create countervailing forces that impose other values on society. And the progressive movement began to do that. It didn't complete the work by any stretch of the imagination.
I would argue that it did so much more in word than in deed. That's where you and I differ. Mm-hmm. So we don't need to have an argument, but I just think that's where folks who are listening can just examine how much of it was in laws and in declarations and how much was actually applied. That's why I don't think we would have had the Great Depression if the progressive era had done what a lot of people claim that it had done. But anyway, I mean, the point being, fundamentally, the movement, the grip of kleptocracy on the industrialized world was not broken really until the 1930s.
Yeah, I will agree with that. I mean, we had World War I, which kind of turned everything upside down. And one thing you learn when you study inequality is this distressing fact that the moments of the greatest progress always seem to come after catastrophic wars.
Well, that's exactly what I write about, in fact, is that when I looked for what was the turning, what did break the grip of these kleptocracies, it really was the series of calamities. It wasn't just World War I or just the Depression. I mean, it really took World War I, Depression, World War II. That's 2 world wars, 2 genocides, use of the nuclear bomb, a pandemic that makes COVID look like a bad rerun, and an economic meltdown that makes 2008 look like a bad rerun.
Although sandwiched in there, you have the 1920s, where you have,
which was kleptocracy rampant,
surging
kleptocracy,
wealth, more innovations, more technological innovations during that period than I think any time in American history before or since, which created enormous wealth, which created
but also giant speculation on the stock market, which gave us 1929.
Right.
And so what I'm saying is that you didn't get any of the measures that really curbed that business model until after all of those calamities. And so the concern I have and I'm just keeping my eye on the clock a little bit because I think we've got some questions piling up there, and love to let folks who have, offered us an hour of their time join the conversation. I mean, what scares me is that the parallel between the period from 1980 to now and the period beginning 1870 is quite significant. I mean, it really, the repeated stock market meltdowns, starting with savings and loan and .com, the lost wars, the 2008. And so I find myself wondering, what if we don't get a grip on this? What is the scale of the calamity that it will drive us into this time around? And that makes my hair stand on end. And that's why I feel like, you know, as much as it's fun to argue about, you know, the progressive era and things like that, I actually think this is pretty urgent. And that's why
I agree on where we end up. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's why I wrote this book, which I have to say was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I had no idea it was going to be this difficult. I expected to find what I found, but that didn't prepare me for how it would feel to find it. And I don't want to scare people off by saying that, but it's just that it's pretty dire. And if we as American citizens don't pull ourselves together to address it, and frankly, stop falling for, I think, one of the most effective devices that kleptocratic networks use against us, which is the identity divides, we are in for trouble. And so for me, the polarization that we're living in now is not just painful as an American citizen to see my society torn apart, but to me, it's also making, it's like, it's the dream of the kleptocrats on both sides of the political aisle. So long as we are fighting each other, it means we can't join forces to rein them in.
Let's yes, invite questions. We don't have very many, so let me.
I think we may have a lot in chat because I'm seeing a large number
yes, I think you're
of
right.
chats, and so I think that the questions may have gone into chat.
Okay, yes, you're quite right. Let's see. A lot of these are okay.
A lot of these are comments. Maybe go to question and answer first, since we have 5.
Moses, somebody who I don't recall that you write. You write about lots of different episodes of accumulation of power and corruption. I don't recall whether you write about Robert Moses in your book.
I do not.
This is a question about Moses. Robert Moses, a former New York City Parks Commission, himself not necessarily corrupt and seeking monetary gain, however, abused power and facilitating administrative practice, which over time devolved into corruption extreme. How can this type of influence be at least controlled, as Moses was indeed the power, even the power superior to the elected? And I think that's a good question. Moses is somebody who began actually as a progressive and imposed a view of development that was very favorable to big developers. Not in his case, I think, out of greed, is out of conviction. But he was indifferent to the voices of people who were saying, this isn't working, the people for whom Jane Jacobs spoke when she wrote her book about the cities and about the value of small scale communities in cities, for which Moses had complete contempt. He wasn't interested in taking that kind of eye level view. Do you have any thoughts about where Moses fits into your scheme of American corruption?
Well, corruption in general, actually. He's, as I say, these networks are sophisticated and they cross sectors. And so he's one of these kind of power brokers who ends up, you know, without necessarily having a government office, although if he was Parks Commissioner, he did. I mean, it's a way that these networks function is often the most powerful person isn't the one with the top job. Mm-hmm. And I think you can look at this here under a number of presidencies, some might argue, including the current one, in which the sort of CEO is a little bit of a front for formally subordinate officials who actually are controlling more of the power.
I think accountability is important here too, because it's the story of Robert Moses is one of those stories that chills the blood whenever you think of the phrase public-private partnership.
Well, exactly.
Partnerships are often completely unaccountable, and
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
No accountability. So when he was wrong, even if wrong out of goodwill, there was no mechanism for setting him straight.
And I'm not in a position to talk about Mosley's will. I mean, you keep wanting to ascribe intentions, good intentions to people, which is great. I just don't know. I mean, but public-private partnership, I could not agree with you more. And I looked at those in depth in Honduras, and it was exactly what you're talking about. It was a way of moving money, public money, off budget into a private contract, which then was no longer accessible to the citizens. And so as we in this country talk about a giant infrastructure project, a kind of infrastructure campaign, now is the time, as happy as we may be that we got something bipartisan out of our Congress, I think it's up to us as citizens to really apply the oversight. I think the COVID pandemic is another example when suddenly the public purse is kind of opened in an emergency context. Emergencies can both bring about reform, as you said, Tim, but they can also be wonderful opportunities for corruption. And this infrastructure campaign, unless it has citizens' oversight, pretty significantly built into it, the type of public-private partnership that can happen both at the state and federal level, I think is a danger.
If you could follow up on that, just with some comment about the role of the press and the whole notion that sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Sunlight is good, but to mix our metaphors, if you only have a hammer and you don't have an anvil, you're just swinging in the air, like the press is very important, but if there isn't follow-up, I sometimes think that we ask the press to do too much. The press cannot prosecute or convict. It can certainly provide evidence, but if, and once again, we're in a context of re-examining the criminal justice system in this country, some police need to be refunded, not defunded, and that is the corporate crime and corruption police. Those resources, both police and prosecution, have been just decimated, and they've been demoralized by the types of rulings that we started this conversation with. And so the press is great so long as there is both personnel, budget, and guidance at the national and state and local levels to do something with what the press reveals.
And I have to add, and I think you do talk about this a little bit in your book, the decline of reporting at the sort of mid-sized newspapers around the country.
I mean, it's a cataclysm. That being said, of late, with some really interesting consortia and collaboration, which had been rare in the press in the past, I think we have seen remarkable investigations, both internationally, things like the Pandora Paradise and Panama Papers, and also locally. I think ProPublica has been partnering with local newspapers and providing some resources that way. But again, if we believe in integrity in our governments, I think all of us need to figure out how we can support investigative reporting on the local level. And more of these mid-level newspapers are actually going nonprofit so that they can accept gifts from readers. And that it's a kind of public radioization, an NPRization of newspapers, and that's fine if it can keep them afloat. I think there's a lot of questions in there.
Right. I want to put in a good word too for Report for America, which is an excellent organization that is sending reporters into these newsrooms on the model of Teach for America.
Great.
Let's see. We have please talk about corruption in the Defense Department budget.
Ah, excellent question, which I do on corruption, looking in particular at Iraq. And this sort of post 9/11, again, crisis, which gave a lot of rein to, bloated budgets in defense, in the defense sphere. Let me take a different tack on that question, just given recent events. The fall of Afghanistan. I'm not going to take us down an Afghanistan rabbit hole. Having lived there for a decade, I could do that. We could do another hour. But let me take one piece of it, which is, why did we think we had to build an Afghan army in our image? Why did we keep hearing that the Afghan National Army needed US medevac and air support? I didn't see the Taliban with any air support. I didn't see the Afghan Mujahideen who defeated the Soviet Union having air support. So what was the incentive structure that drove us to build a top-heavy, base-bound, technology-tied conventional army in an insurgency situation? And the answer has to be to do with this question, that there's a financial intersection between DoD and the defense contracting, the old military-industrial complex. And, in this town, we just have to look at what has happened along Route 66 and in McLean and look at the mushrooming McMansions that surround this city that have sprung up since about the mid-1990s, right? And certainly since 2001. And look at 2 lost wars. And again, you think about failing states, right? Well, failing or fragile states are states run by kleptocratic networks that are very successful in achieving their objectives, which are making money. Well, look at the defense industry. Failed policies and enriched executives who have cycled in and out of government at every level, at every level. On the civilian side, it's former contracting executives. The military side, it's uniforms who go straight out onto the boards of contracting firms, which the World War II generals would not have dreamed of doing.
And it's hard to even tell the difference between the two, right? Because the majority
exactly.
of defense dollars now go to outside contractors.
Exactly. And the other one that's almost identical is Treasury and Wall Street. So again, let me give a COVID example, which is the $6 trillion that Jerome Powell and the rest of the Fed pumped into the bond markets over the last couple of years. Well, who did they do a lot of that through? Let's see, they didn't, so the New York Fed did not actually buy the bonds itself. The New York Fed set up an LLC, a limited liability corporation, that is a private company, where in the state of Delaware, which is, one of the most famous secrecy jurisdictions in the world. And that private corporation enacted a no-bid contract with BlackRock, which allowed BlackRock to do the bond buying with $6 trillion of public money. Now go and take a look at the revolving door project, at the highway linking BlackRock and Treasury and the Fed. So this is why the words that we use like revolving door aren't even sufficient, because again, that suggests that one individual is pushing a door, whereas instead what you have is a thickly woven tapestry between the defense contractors and the Pentagon, and between Wall Street and Treasury.
Hang on just a moment. I wonder whether you've seen Frank Vogel's new book entitled The Enablers, How the West Supports Kleptocrats and Corruption, Endangering Our Democracy, and can comment on how organizations like Transparency International can help contain corruption in countries across the world.
So that's an interesting one. Yeah, I know Frank very well. We're old friends. And it's, he does terrific work. My only caveat on that book and on a lot of the thinking that is happening now in the international anti-corruption world is that the focus is on the enablers, which are important. But it's almost like saying the real kleptocrats are still over there. They're still the Kazakhs and the Putins and, Obiango and Nigeria, right? And the only people in the West who are doing wrong are basically the banks and the real estate companies that take their money. Whereas I feel like we have to get even closer to home and realize how much our own system is coming or has come to resemble the systems of the countries that we like to point fingers at, so that we're not just doing the enabling. The enablers are enabling us as well as enabling, foreign corrupt officials. And I would say about transparency, and again, I literally just gave a talk at Transparency France. I love it. I love that it exists. It's put the issue on the map. But if transparency were really doing a great job, we wouldn't have had an Arab Spring. We wouldn't have had, the revolution in Ukraine. We wouldn't have had to. If we, and I include myself, anti-corruption professionals were really making a dent, then citizens would not be, joining insurrections. And so I feel as though we're not quite up to the demand that's out there. We have not generated reforms that, to go back to our earlier exchange, we anti-corruption professionals haven't generated the kinds of reforms that could really change the situation in a serious way.
We have a question from Steve Dutke. I haven't been reciting the names of the questioners. I'm sorry about that. Would it be useful to have inspector generals for non-governmental organizations? Interesting.
Oh boy, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's a wonderful question and a wonderful idea because, non-governmental organizations have also become either image launderers or fronts or are themselves members of kleptocratic networks. So I've seen that in the developing world. Honduras just had an election yesterday that's a pretty interesting outcome. But I had seen how the Nationalist Party, the current president, was using philanthropic organizations and development organizations basically to pay off his or reward his political backers. And here you can look at both the Clinton and Trump foundations as pretty questionable. Again, no false equivalencies, but you have to hold your own community, whichever it is, up to its highest standards. And I think that both of those organizations are questionable in terms of what their real purposes were. And I think a lot of the think tanks that stud this city, start looking at where they're getting their money from. Council on Foreign Relations took a huge, I think it's $21 million donation from Leonid Blavatnik, who is absolutely a member of Putin's network. Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, for which I used to work, has a $4 million gift from Charles Koch, who has spent his entire adult life trying to dismantle democracy in this country and whose businesses between 2000 and 2010 were guilty of almost 400 violations of local and federal laws and regulations. So here you have, the democracy and rule of law program accepting money that was earned that way. It's getting very, I think, problematic. And I think the nonprofit sector needs a lot more oversight than it has had. Great question.
I can't resist sharing an anecdote of my own when I tried, when was this? About a dozen years ago, I guess, to set up a project on the future of labor at various liberal think tanks. And to my amazement, I kept hearing the same thing, which was, Tim, liberal think tanks and conservative think tanks are very different in lots of ways, but in one way they are exactly alike, and that is that they are funded by people who cannot stand labor unions. Do you have any thoughts about the role that labor might play in reform and corruption?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that was really delightful in going back and looking at the 19th century was looking at the opposition to kleptocracy at that time. And I was really blown away. I mean, there were the labor movements that we've heard about, but I hadn't really dug into the sort of philosophy that I hadn't dug into the sophistication of the recommendations they were making and their understanding of what it is to be human. I mean, the 8-hour day, which was not just about we need to sleep. It was in order to be human, you need time for work, time for rest, but also time to develop all the other elements of who you are. And the cultural effervescence was extraordinary. The courage, the solidarity, and the collective action, which really is the only thing I think that's powerful enough to rein business in. And I just don't think that we as dissociated individuals can really put the kind of pressure on our public officials that is needed. And so the revival of labor activism that we're starting to see at the moment, I think is an incredibly encouraging thing. And I think that out of those movements is likely to come some very interesting thinking about how to revitalize democracy with a little d, which to me is about reining in the meat hogs. I mean, you can't have democracy so long as you have people hogging more than their fair share of the collectively hunted meat, right? So I'd like to just mention he lost, but a man named Stephen Smith ran for governor of West Virginia in 2020. And his campaign was really extraordinary because it was and it was very heavily labor focused, but it was in the midst of the West Virginia teacher strike and things like that. But what it was a collectively developed platform. So he actually went around and in town meetings and in one-on-ones and in write-ins and things like that, just brought together everyone's suggestions and then spent, with some of his key advisors, 3 or 4 days boiling them down into a platform, which he then had voted by kind of committees of supporters. And when he lost, he lost. And so I actually think there are some quite innovative approaches to how we could revive our democracy. And I do think that organized labor of a new sort is going to be a part of that.
Final question is about developing countries. Kleptocratic networks often have and kind of depend on control of some actual product, maybe oil, maybe a crop, maybe a manufacturing niche, to have the money that keeps the favors flowing. And this is talked about the curse of natural resources. Some of the most interesting voices in your book I found were these wonderfully pithy comments by various Nigerians who, of course, live with the curse of rich natural resources. And they have the most provocative and interesting ideas about the nature of money, the nature of wealth. There was one proverb, I forget what it was, but the gist of it was that that wealth is a kind of punishment. Can you talk a little bit about resource-based wealth in these countries?
Yes, I mean, it's not only for the favors, it's that kleptocratic networks have an eye for revenue streams. Mm-hmm. And so when, natural resources are, as you say, they're number one. And again, so the question is about the developing world, but I look homewards. I did a paper on the oil curse in particular, with a colleague, and we colored the map of the world as to where along a kind of spectrum of distorted economy on one end all the way across to violent conflict. And the oil-rich countries that seem to have neither of those were, that we painted green, were Norway and the United States. And maybe Canada to some extent. And sometime after it was published, I thought harder and I said, now, wait a minute, what if we look subnationally? Let's look inside the United States at oil producing areas or fossil fuel producing areas. And you get Appalachia and you get, the Northern Midwest and you get Eastern California and you get Texas. And when you look at that level, you start seeing some of the very similar things. You start seeing distorted economies, tremendous income inequality, corrupt politics, you name it, right? And in some cases, violent conflict. And so the resource curse is a real curse. But then what I would say, though, is that what I discovered is even in oil countries like Tunisia, there will be other revenue streams that are captured. So there, the whole banking system became a revenue stream. But I even noticed that dates serve the purpose,
right?
Because very luscious dates that are exported to the Gulf are very valuable, and the control on date growing is water. And of course, I had imagined, these are oases with the palm trees with their roots in the ground. I had forgotten, no, we're in the age of irrigation. Well, who owns the pipes? The water company. The water department, of the government. And so that gave the government an opportunity to squeeze people. And another revenue stream that I have seen, particularly in Honduras, where I looked at it, but it's something to keep strongly in mind, is climate finance. So in all the conversations about how the CO2 emitting countries need to help finance developing countries, develop, I want to say kind of green or sustainable development, there's again a kind of flurry or a rush to get the money into the pipelines. And I'm saying, wait a second, I've already seen kleptocratic systems or kleptocratic networks that have figured out how to capture that money. And so care needs to be taken that this doesn't become yet another revenue stream that is captured by these networks, and the policies that it is meant to fund don't happen.
Your discussion of oil reminds me, and I think we'll end on this, of a nice illustration of, you talk about the Hydra, which is this many-headed network. And in the United States, my favorite oil corruption story concerns Teapot Dome, where Edward Doheny gave Albert Fall, the Interior Secretary, a big fat bribe. And Albert Fall was tried and convicted and sent to jail. After he was tried and convicted and sent to jail, Edward Doheny went on trial. And he called on all the civic leaders of greater Los Angeles to speak on his behalf at the trial, one of whom was the president of the University of Southern California, who spoke on Doheny's behalf. Doheny was acquitted, even though the guy who he gave the bribe to was already in jail and had been convicted of accepting the bribe. But somehow the jury concluded that even though Albert Fall accepted the bribe, nobody actually gave the bribe. And after he was acquitted, Doheny made a huge gift to the University of Southern California Doheny Library. You see it today on campus, big, beautiful kind of Gothic structure. It was Doheny's thank you note to the president of USC for helping him beat the bribery rap.
Exactly.
Anyway, well, thank you. This has been a really stimulating conversation, and I'll turn it over to you, Brad.
Yeah, well, thanks, Tim, for bringing your own expertise to what's been a lively discussion. And thank you, Sarah, for making the great effort that you do in your book to highlight the system of kleptocratic networks that runs through our society and that poses such a threat to social stability. Let's hope your warnings as an experienced anti-corruption professional are indeed heeded. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of On Corruption in America. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
And I would just like to, that is a beautiful ending, but I would like to also add my thanks, which I haven't been able to do so far. It's just very meaningful to me that people like you take the time, particularly in this less than ideal format, to listen to a conversation like this, to participate in your own ways. And what I am going to ask Brad is whether we can capture your questions and answers and chat, because I actually have not been able to follow them out, and I would very much like to do so and read through them. And maybe even, is there a way that I could provide some answers and it could be posted? Brad, do you think that's doable?
Well, let me ask our technical person who's behind the scenes here. Chelsea, can we capture these the Q&A and chat comments?
I'll have to check on that. What I might do is see what I can do on my end, which may not be very technically beautiful, which is just doing a screen grab. But then I'll circle around with our tech folks and see what we can do.
That would be great. And then we could just post it next to the recording of this. Sorry to upset our your beautiful drawing of this to a close.
No, that's quite all right. It's
kind of fun.
Good question. It's the first time we've had it. So
yeah, and then I could just try to, or
questions.
you know what I'll do? You know what I'll do? If we can't post it on the Politics and Prose website, what I'll try to do is make a blog out of it on my website, which is sarahchayes.org. First name, last name, no dot in the middle.org. But we'll confab and give me a few days to let this happen. But I just feel as though there really was a lot of interaction from you folks, and I don't want that to be lost.
I know we can save the chat. It's just it's the Q&A.
Yeah.
The questions in the Q&A that I'm not sure we can capture, but we'll give it a try.
All right.